I'm Billy S, welcome back to the channel. Today we're wrapping up my major coverage of Bloodborne as my community ranks the Chalice dungeon bosses from easiest to hardest. For the purposes of this video, I asked my community to only rank the bosses via their appearances in the preset Chalice dungeon layouts, which means Amygdala, Keeper of the Old Lords, and Watchdog of the Old Lords all have their defiled variants swaying the vote. My community ranks each boss on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being stupidly easy, 10 being impossibly difficult, and I work out the averages to get the final score. We didn't have a ton of votes for this poll, but honestly, it's the Chalice dungeons, I get it. If you're interested in my personal rankings of the Chalice dungeon bosses, from a quality standpoint as opposed to difficulty, I've already made that video. It was a lot of fun, it'll be in the link in the description. So let's not waste any time. My community's Chalice dungeon bosses, easiest to hardest, ranked. Let me know which boss is your easiest and hardest down below. In last place, we have the Man-Eater Boar, who scored a total average of 1.3 out of 10. We've officially made history, as Man-Eater Boar is now the new holder of the easiest boss in Soulsborne. Something tells me, even as we cover Dark Souls 2, 3, Sekiro, and Elden Ring, I don't think that'll change. The Man-Eater Boar, like many of the Chalice dungeon's filler bosses, are reused enemies given a health bar, and as such, it feels like cheating to even have them on a list like this. The only dangerous attack the boar has is its charge, which if you don't dodge correctly can knock you over. But the moment you avoid it, you're in perfect range to hit him with a charged heavy attack that'll likely stun or at least do major damage. Even if you fight this guy when it's intended during the game, the large arena gives you enough movement that you should never feel cornered at any point. The Man-Eater Boar being a Chalice dungeon boss is the laziest thing in this entire game. Yeah. I put Man-Eater boss as my least favorite. It's not offensive, it's just a nothing boss. It's an enemy we've seen a dozen times before, and it's a giant pig! Whoopee! That's the most frustrating aspect of the Man-Eater Boar fight. It isn't offensive, it's just filler. Pure, unadulterated filler. But as one commenter points out, at least I got a kick out of seeing a boss health bar being tacked on to something like a Man-Eater Boar or a Brain Sucker. There is that element of, that's so stupid that it loops back around to being iconic, but I'm not really sure the Man-Eater Boar quite works its way there. And we'll be getting to the Brain Sucker after a brief detour. At number 19, we have the Celestial Emissary Rematch, who scored a total average of 1.58 out of 10. As I pointed out during my Chalice Dungeon boss ranking video, the Celestial Emissary Rematch is flawed from the jump, because it takes away what I'd consider to be the one threatening aspect of the fight. There are no minions to help protect the boss. Instead, we start in its large, enraged state, which has extremely easy to dodge attacks, and only succeeds at being a bit of a damage sponge as you wail on it with your chosen weapon. It's tanky, but can't capitalize on that due to its piss-poor melee attacks and inability to consistently use its magic. Interestingly, it only received 8 votes for easiest boss, compared to the Brain Sucker's 15 votes, but in the voting process, the Emissary had all of their scores consolidated into the 1s, 2s, and 3s, while the Brain Sucker had a couple 4s and 5s in there. I think I'd switch them around on this list myself, but it doesn't change anything, let's be real. It's such a forgettable fight that not a single comment chose to mention the Emissary, and honestly, I respect it. When you're clearly outshone by your main game counterpart, it's probably best that people forget you exist too. At number 18, we have the Brain Sucker, who scored a total average of 1.73 out of 10. Fun fact, the Brain Sucker was ranked as the least favorite boss among the voters, 22 votes in all, and I get it. After all, in the main game, Brain Suckers start off threatening with their ability to grab and consume your insight. They're weak to thrust weapons, but you always have that fear after an attack that you're about to get hit by an arcane spell that paralyzes you, or you won't have the space to roll back. But here in the Chalice dungeon, this enemy only appears in the Ys Chalice, which is obtained after beating Aaviier in the main game, aka after you've gone through Upper Cathedral Ward and you're fully familiar with this enemy type, and you've likely killed a whole host of them. And this time around, you're fighting in a multi-level arena with various pillars that you can hide behind to avoid its attacks. The Brainsucker is at a severe disadvantage, but at least it can catch you off guard, even if it's never enough to kill. The worst boss is the Brainsucker. It's not just a normal enemy, it's the most annoying normal enemy. At least the man-eater boar has a couple of unique moves. To that, I definitely have to agree. The Brainsucker cycles between spamming its ranged magic or running in for a grab, and there's absolutely nothing in between. It's the world's worst game of chess. I hate the Brainsucker. I hated it in Upper Cathedral Ward, I hated that one Brainsucker in the corner of Cathedral Ward, and I especially hate this one in the Chalice dungeon. Who thought that this would be a great idea for a boss? Hey, let's make one of the most irritating enemies a boss and give it a huge-ass health bar. Yeah, it sounds like a great idea, FromSoft, thanks a bunch. I could feel the passion behind this comment, and I agree. While I love their designs, I think as actual enemies, they're some of the most frustrating to fight, and a boss variant just doesn't change that. I wish I could find someone in my life to treat me well like the Brainsucker does to the Hunter. I could feel the passion behind this comment, and I agree. Get yourself someone who'll suck that insight right out of your brain anytime they make eye contact with you. It's called love, baby. At number 17, we have the Merciless Watchers and Chieftain, who score a total average of 2.56 out of 10. A trio gank fight, I can't say I'm shocked to see them ranking this low, because they're made up of regular enemies that you'll find throughout the Chalice dungeons, ones that you'll have a lot of experience with by the time you go against their harder variant in the lower Pthumerian Chalice. There's no point in discussing the appearance in the first Chalice dungeon, as their health crumples like paper, and their arena has multiple levels to make breaking the trio apart easier. Their harder variant at least has an arena that's a flat plane, which makes it harder to crowd control, but even then... You might find yourself in trouble if you get too greedy doing big damage, but if you can handle ROM, or the Living Failures, or any number of gank fights from other Souls games, you're gonna be fine. Now there's one voter comment I paraphrased in an earlier entry, and this time I want to show you the full quote. Among the other common enemy types that were repurposed as Chalice bosses, I feel that the Merciless Watcher and Chieftain are the most trivial and egregious example. These ogre-like creatures are already unremarkable individually, so shoving them into a gank encounter seems like they're compensating. The fight has little tension, since each Watcher waddles towards you at a snail's pace, and they're fairly easy to separate from one another. At least I get a kick out of seeing a boss health bar being tacked onto something like a man-eater boar or Brainsucker. With these fellas, I feel nothing. I would have forgotten about their existence had it not been for this ranking. This seems to be the running sentiment, though I can't verify this due to this boss being so unremarkable they didn't get any other comments. The most stock footage gank fight you've ever seen. At number 16, we have the Loran Silverbeast, who scored a total average of 3.17 out of 10. The last of the really basic enemies that got dragged into being bosses in the Chalice dungeons, I still find the decision to make the Loran Silverbeast a boss baffling, as unlike the Brainsuckers or the Man-Eater Boars, these guys are plastered all over the mid to late game nightmare areas, to the point where they almost feel too common. The first form of the torch is the easy part, as it's easy to whittle down the health bar with a good few smacks of a strong weapon, and if you keep up the aggression, you could kill the Silverbeast without even experiencing its enraged state, where it drops to its 4 legs and goes to town with leaps and lunges. It surprised me during my playthrough because I genuinely forgot they had the ability to do this, but it was enough to leave an impression on me. Not so much with the voters. I completely forgot about the Loran Silver and Dark Beasts. I don't remember fighting them. Now to be fair, they only show up in the Loran Chalices, so I actually understand this sentiment. The Silver Beasts are still forgettable there though, because they're used more when it comes to guarding ritual items or floor levers, so of course you'd forget that one of them is an actual boss. It's a real shame because I think they have a real cool design, but that's just not enough to make a compelling fight. At number 15, we have the Beast-Possessed Soul, who scored a total average of 3.53 out of 10. The first Chalice dungeon boss that really left an impression on me. He appears twice as the Layer 1 boss of the Ailing Loran and Central Pthumerian Chalices, and while he's not the hardest fight, he's got one hell of a sick design. He uses fireballs to attack the player, either as projectiles or by breathing the flames in your direction like a flamethrower, on top of the usual bestial claw swipes. He appears in fairly easy chalices, which means his health isn't anything to write home about, which is a real shame because give this man a buff or put him in a defiled chalice and I think he becomes a genuine threat. His grab attack powers him up into a more dangerous state, similar to Dark Souls 2's Pursuer, meaning if you play well, you don't have to worry about that extra element, but if you play badly, you're going to experience a small difficulty spike from the Beast-Possessed Soul gaining that momentum. Sadly, once again, no comments from our voters. As said, we don't have a large sample size this video, so there are quite a few entries that didn't really have anyone talking about them. But it's worth noting he is one of the few bosses who didn't receive a vote for worst boss of the Chalice dungeons, and even netted 2 best boss votes. And just one person ranked him as their hardest boss. He's got a fan base out there, he just needed a little more oomph to really take control of his destiny and become a real threat. At number 14, we have the Blood-Starved Beast, who scored a total average of 4.6 out of 10. The first proper boss to be brought over from the main game, Celestial Emissary, get the fuck out. I'm not shocked to see a low ranking for our good old skin flaps, but I am impressed at the jump from our previous entry from 3.53 to 4.6. He's the exact same boss fight you get in the main game, and in the Old Hunters DLC. Light a weapon up with flames, dodge to the left every time he attacks, swing your weapon when in range, and watch the damage go up. The only danger comes from how fast the beast's attacks come out, which means if you're not careful, you could be on the receiving end of a couple claws to the face. Then there's the poison, which while not as dangerous in the chalices as it was in the early game at Old Yharnam, is still worth moderating. Have an antidote or 2 on hand and you will be fine. I think the Blood-Starved Beast in the Ailing Loran chalice is harder than the one in the Hintertomb chalice, both because of the scaling and because there's nowhere to hide in such a circular small arena. Maybe you can make the case that the poison pools of the Hintertomb variant are dangerous if you go there earlier in the game, but honestly, once you kill Blood-Starved once in Bloodborne, it's like riding a bike, you never truly forget it. And once again, I'm shocked to see no comments about them. They're a base game boss, they had their time in the Bloodborne community ranking a few weeks back, it's okay for us to move on to better pastures. At number 13, we have the Forgotten Madman and Madman's Escort, who scored a total average of 4.61 out of 10. The resident hunter versus hunter fight of the Chalice dungeons, difficulty will vary. If you're into PvP, you can bisect this man in half with ease, whereas if you're like me and you're less used to fighting players all the time, these 2 NPCs could gang up on you. They received 2 hardest votes from the voters, which also translated into 2 people ranking them a 10 for difficulty. Were they memeing, or are they stuck on the battle to this day? We'll never know. But the Forgotten Madman and Escort were able to maximize their joint slay by securing the highest amount of 4s and 5s in the voting pool. The Madman at least was using a meta weapon, Ludwig's Holy Blade, which is definitely a useful tool for lasting in a fight against enemy hunters. It acts as a close range and mid-range attack tool due to the large nature of the big sword. But my Kirkhammer does the same thing. The challenge just comes from managing 2 hunter enemies, one of which can use arcane spells, which makes the fight 10 times more difficult because arcane attacks in Bloodborne can be brutal if they connect. And, like their namesake, we've got another boss forgotten by the voters. The penalty, as said, for having a smaller pool of submissions this time around. But I think they're honestly a pretty fair, balanced fight, and they're as hard as they need to be for the point in the chalices they appear in. At number 12, we have the Undead Giant, who scored a total average of 4.75 out of 10. Of all the more basic fights in the Chalice dungeons, I can tell the Undead Giant had the most spread in regards to his difficulty, because despite landing in the bottom half of the list, that Ball and Chain variant definitely had many of the voters in a chokehold, as there are 3 variations of this boss, the Cannon, the Curved Swords, and the Ball and Chain, and of the 3, the first 2 I mentioned just then are extremely easy to defeat. Curved Swords is the first boss of the entire Chalice dungeon, so it was always going to go down a piece of cake. The cannon, while the third you encounter, doesn't have many opportunities to use its ranged attack if you stick close by, and your damage output should be strong enough you can melt the boss quickly. But that chain variant with its exorbitant hitboxes is infamous among the community, as my voters can attest to. The Chained Undead Giant shares my least favourite boss with the Brainsucker for the simple fact that, in 500 plus game hours, I have no idea how to consistently dodge the chains without simply keeping distance. They also do so much damage, right? Despite the Ball and Chain Giant appearing second out of the 3 encounters, it by far does the most damage to the player. Absolutely brutal when you're not expecting it. I'd like to point out that the Ball and Chain variant of the Undead Giant on my Platinum playthrough a while ago unironically killed me more than most, or maybe outright, every boss from the actual game. The one-shot potential of this guy is insane with the counter damage included, and he has a surprisingly complex positioning requirement for a boss, other variants of which are one of the easiest Chalice dungeon bosses. It's fitting that his weapons of choice are a ball and chain, because you better be into that sort of shit if you intend on fighting him with low damage and HP. I'd like to say that the Ball and Chain Giant is a skill check for the rest of the Chalice dungeons, but I don't think I should give a boss that has extremely wonky hitboxes any form of credit. It's crazy because had I decided to split the Undead Giant into 3 variations for this ranking, I think Ball and Chain bumps up to top 5 in difficulty. At number 11, we have the Keeper of the Old Lords, who scored a total average of 5.28 out of 10. The Keeper of the Old Lords is a flame-based boss who can create flame cones that expand towards the player. On top of this, they have some pretty strong slash combos that if you're caught up in, will result in your death. Their difficulty comes from their Defiled Chalice variant, as the normal version's pretty easy to burst down since you can tank attacks and heal through them without issue. In the Defiled Chalice, unless you know the exact parry timings to make the fight easier, you have to actively dodge through attacks and perfectly capitalize on any punish windows. The Keeper recovers quickly, and their combos come out fast and furious. Plus, if you're too close, they can just blast you with flame at point-blank range, ending your run. Of the Defiled bosses, I find them the easiest, as you'll eventually click with their patterns and know when to dodge back, when to dodge in, and when to let your Kirkhammer or weapon of choice do the talking. Keeper of the Old Lords is my absolute favourite, especially the Defiled variant, which was not something I thought I would say. The Keeper has a beautiful design and a very fun fight. Their high damage makes the fight more methodical, as you can't just burst them down with high damage yourself. Exactly what I just said, dear voter, you have to take the fight slow and steady, which might annoy some people who don't enjoy the art of patience, but if the battle is well designed, overcoming their strategies with your own can feel very fulfilling. I love the Keeper of the Old Lords, everything about them is awesome. The design is peak fashion souls, the fight actually feels quite fun and balanced with their attacks and pyromancies. I'm a sucker for curved sword-wielding pyromancers. Too bad we don't get to use any of them as hunter tools, big sad. The confidence is absolutely oozing with the strut, and they could totally burn me and I wouldn't mind it at all. What the fuck is wrong with me? Woo! There's nothing wrong with you at all. I mean, that armor set, I get it. And I agree, of all the pyromancy bosses in the Chalices, I think the Keeper of the Old Lords has the most stylish of movesets. They make me want to learn pyromancy in other Souls games, even though I don't particularly like fire-based builds. Just a really solid, balanced fight that hits right on the middle of our difficulty chart. Though there is at least one voter who did have a bad experience with them. The Defiled Chalice was the single most torturous thing in the game, with the Defiled Keeper of the Old Lords being the hardest for me. Her moves and combos always seem to catch me at the worst times and obliterate my health pool even at 50. And to make it even worse, I had an attempt where I almost killed her, but she got stuck in the ceiling after a parry due to what I assumed to be a glitch, making me unable to kill her. I almost broke a controller that day. Personally, I think it's a skill issue. You should also glitch through the ceiling with your Eldritch Great One powers and finish them off in their own domain. I mean, come on. I'm kidding, of course. If that happened to me, I would probably scream into a pillow or something and uninstall the game. Hey all, sorry to be a bother, but I'm trying to reach 35,000 subscribers by October of 2024. If, after finishing this video, you like what you see, consider parrying that subscribe button to stay up to date on all my future videos. Back to the regularly scheduled programming. At number 10, we have Rom, the Vacuous Spider, who scored a total average of 6.05 out of 10. And I'm surprised, because Chalice Dungeon Rom has scored a higher difficulty ranking than Byrgenwerth Rom, and I don't personally understand how that's ended up the case. We've talked about Rom at length in past videos, but her major danger is her ability to cast magic constantly after the first phase of her fight. Meteors either falling from the sky or rising from the floor, as well as that irritating AoE that stops players from standing next to her the entire fight, which she spams a tad too much for my liking. Her contact damage is definitely increased in the Chalice dungeons, I'll give her that one. Had a few moments where her little roll shake attack almost killed me, much to my horror. But her babies are easy to kill, and I personally think her fight is made easier by the pillars throughout the room that you can use to block her meteor strikes. She's ultimately still ranked at around a 6 for difficulty, and with 13 votes for least favourite boss of the Chalice dungeons, I can tell she's not exactly a favourite among the community. I remember on my first run through of the Chalices, getting absolutely bodied by Rom. I was very underleveled, but also very stubborn. I don't know how many times I died, but I'm pretty sure Rom still has the most kills on me of any bosses in the Chalices, and possibly more than main game Rom. Seriously, I find this so fascinating to think about, as I really feel the arena for Rom is much easier in the Chalices. Perhaps that upgraded damage due to her being an adept-free Chalice was enough to tip the scales in her favour? During my Platinum run, the Chalice dungeon version of Rom beat me more than 20 times. She was incredibly frustrating, especially after destroying her original version in a minute by ignoring the spiders and attacking her directly. But after many tries, I realized that the game was telling me to use a different strategy. I started whacking spiders left and right, and managed to beat her quite easily in around 5 minutes. I appreciate that Chalice Dungeon Rom guides you to change your strategy instead of just rehashing the same fight under worse circumstances and expecting you to beat it in the same way, like Amygdala does. Yeah, due to the smaller arena, killing Rom spiders is the best strategy for the Chalice boss to make your life easier. In the first phase, you've got ample time to take them out one by one, and in the magic phase, as I've said a bunch of times, you can use the pillars to block the magic, which gives you time to kill the babies. It can be a little claustrophobic at times, but I really feel like this was how Rom's fight was intended from a gameplay standpoint. Fuck Rom. All versions of Rom. Mama, kudos for saying that, for spilling. At number 9, we have the Pthumerian Elder, who scored a total average of 6.06 out of 10. My personal favourite boss from the Chalice dungeons. I'm not shocked to see him just barely crack the top half of the difficulty rankings. After all, I didn't like him because he was hard, I liked him because of his insane moveset potential. The Elder can conjure just about any weapon you can think of with his flames, creating a very versatile battle style that, on a faster, more agile creature, would have genuinely given me a lot of trouble. He's the prototype for Morgott for Elden Ring, which tracks because Morgott's my favourite fight from that game, so of course I would love a moveset that summons various weapons. The Pthumerian Elder just really needed to replace the Descendant as the first boss of the final Chalice, and I think he would actually be top 5 on this list. Because he has so many different moves to draw from, you have to be prepared for everything, especially when he starts upping the ante after half health with all his combos and attacks getting faster and stronger. Alongside the Bloodstarved Beast, he didn't receive any votes for easiest or hardest boss, but he did get 5 votes for favourite boss and just 1 vote for least favourite boss. Get behind me, Elder. I won't let that single hater get to you. If I ever decide to delve into the root chalices for a bit of fun, I'd love to try taking on Pthumerian Elder from a more difficult depth, to truly see if he lives up to his potential that I can clearly see when I fight him. But I do agree right now with his placement, as the remaining bosses on this list are all far more deadly. At number 8, we have Yharnam, Pthumerian Queen, who scored a total average of 6.1 out of 10. I wasn't sure where Yharnam was going to rank when I opened this poll, but I think middle of the pack is a correct spot. She's got the health to last a while in her fight, even with a +10 weapon at your side, and her moveset is varied enough that it will catch some players off guard. In fact, in my original Platinum run, she did kill me a few times. Was it due to her fast-acting poison build-up? Or was it because I didn't understand how her paralysis baby cry attack worked? It certainly wasn't because of that one AoE that you have to actively try to get hit by. What I like about Yharnam is that compared to the rest of the Chalice dungeon bosses, she feels like she could be slotted into the main game and I'd be like, yeah sis, that fits. She goes through various phases as you lower her health bit by bit, unlocking more of her moveset until she's cloning herself and sending waves of blood your way with every strike. She doesn't attack fast enough to capitalize on a lot of her moves, and the most danger you'll have is when you're attacking the first clone that appears, because your back will be turned on the other two, who could be doing who knows what behind you. You can't play recklessly against Yharnam, but you don't have to think too terribly hard either. Very well balanced. The voters, meanwhile, have a lot to say. After hours of going through the Chalice dungeons to reach Yharnam through Marion Queen, I thought I was in for a tough fight when I quickly died in my first attempt without dealing any damage to her. Her projectiles caught me off guard. However, in my second attempt, I was more alert, and despite her clones being annoying and having to listen out for cries when in melee range to avoid being rooted to the spot, she was not particularly difficult. The road to getting to the dungeon was the hard part, that defiled Chalice. Also, love your channel, the content is always superb. Thanks for the kind words, I definitely agree with this experience. There's just something about Yharnam where she's got a good moveset, she can get ya on a first run, but she's not actually difficult, and for some, that's actually a disappointment. Para mí, the Yharnam Queen was a complete disappointment. I expected a full-blown Lovecraftian horror with tentacles everywhere, and a second phase with the baby emerging from her, but instead it's just a pseudo-gimmicky boss with a bit of blood and nothing else. The final boss of the Chalice dungeon should have been spectacular, and we know that FromSoft isn't afraid to really hide their best bosses. Dark Lurker, everyone? A huge hug from Spain, I love your accent when you speak Spanish, keep it up, and thanks for your amazing videos. Gracias por esas palabras tan bonitas. Me alegra saber que tengo gente que me ve desde España. A lo mejor intento hablar español más a menudo, quién sabe. And for those of you that don't understand Spanish, I just said thanks for the kind words. Happy to see we've got some viewers from Spain out there. Maybe I'll break out the Spanish a little more, who knows? And I agree with your takes on Yharnam, by the way. I wish she was like a modern Souls boss, and rather than have all her phases tied to a single health bar, we could have a two-stage boss fight that ups the ante. She's difficult, yes, but I do think for such a well-hidden fight, they could have afforded to go full Millennia with her and just make her a straight-up super boss. But then, we have someone who actually thinks the difficulty is perfect, and more power to them. I feel Yharnam is peak boss design and difficulty. It acts very different to the other bosses in the game, and even with punishing attacks, she never feels unfair. The fact that you for once have to rely on sound to dodge her stun, and the fact she uses rapid poison adds even more complexity to the fight. Also, the fact you can recognize her from her clones knowing she's pregnant adds very good to the lore. A very complete hard boss that can compare to the ones in the main game, also she gives you a trophy, what else would you want? Valid point. If there's one thing I can say about Yharnam, she does feel very fair, which is impressive given clone fights in Soulsborne tend to get the short end of the stick in that regard. And with 11 votes for favourite boss of the Chalice dungeons, she's clearly beloved by all. Well done, mama! At number 7, we have the Pthumerian Descendant, who scored a total average of 6.27 out of 10. Now this is a surprise. I was expecting the Descendant to actually be in the top 5, given his damage output is shockingly strong and he's able to play a melee and ranged game against the Hunter. He moves extremely fast, his boomerang-style projectiles can catch you on the rebound, and his parry timings, at least for me, were pretty tough to nail. Maybe I'm just bad at the game, we can't rule that out of course. As he's faced for the last time in the Depth 5 Chalice, we get to face him at his hardest, and he took me for a ride. But I will admit, even though he can kill me, he often doesn't. It's interesting because he's the final humanoid boss on this list, as from now on, it's beasts, kin, and great ones till the end of the road. Fuck the Pthumerian Descendant. My first playthrough, he tore me a new asshole because of his terrible parry timing. I tried too much to parry because that was what I'd gotten used to with most of the Chalice dungeon bosses I'd fought beforehand. When I was trying to get to the Queen quickly using the Chalice glyph, I was unable to get past him and had to go through the regular Chalice dungeons. He made the endgame Chalice dungeons unnecessarily difficult and was a major reason why my platinum journey for Bloodborne took so long. While parrying is certainly a way to break the difficulty of many bosses across the series, I do think the Descendant was given tough parry windows in order to get the player to engage with the fight beyond a simple gunshot, dodge in, visceral, rinse repeat. I can't say I've had experience with Chalice glyphs as I've never played Bloodborne with an active PlayStation Online membership, but I found going through the base game Chalice dungeons a good way for training me against this fight. After all, you battle him at the end of Central Thumeru, and it's a good place to practice learning his moveset because he's not particularly difficult there, nor does he do a ton of damage. But jumping straight to Yharnam's Chalice, I can see why that might cause a difficulty spike. I have been cursed with this information, so I thought it would be fun to torture you all with it too, so the Thumerian Descendant and Elder kind of look like Lady Butterfly, and I hate it. And now I have cursed my audience with that same information. Honestly though, it tracks. Lady Butterfly's moveset would totally fit with Thumerian's style, but thank God she's not in Bloodborne because I fear our hunter would be screwed in that regard. At number 6, we have the Bloodletting Beast, who scored a total average of 6.36 out of 10. As you're seeing, a majority of the top 10 bosses here all fall into the 6s with their averages, which for me denotes that they're actually very well balanced. After all, difficulty rankings aren't just about seeing who's the hardest boss, but also seeing how the difficulty is balanced across the game. Now I need to come clean, I may have forgotten to include the Bloodletting Beast in the poll questions regarding easiest, hardest, favourite, and least favourite Chalice dungeon bosses. It was a rather embarrassing oversight, if I'm being honest. It won't happen again, but luckily we do have some voter comments to help showcase how he would have done had I not been a big dummy. His Parasite variant is where his true difficulty lies, as the Layer 4 appearance in the Lower Thumerian Labyrinth, while tanky, wasn't a particularly challenging fight. I actually brought this boss up in a recent ranking of the Dark Souls Archthrones bosses, as his moveset was reused in the mod for an early game boss fight, and I realised just how generic he feels in any other Soulsborne game. He works in Bloodborne because we're not used to a fight like this, whereas in a Dark Souls game, these types of beasts are a dime a dozen. His difficulty comes from his insane Depth 5 damage output, which is only increased once the Parasite emerges at half health in his final appearance. He has a lunge attack that crosses the whole room and can potentially one-shot anyone who hasn't leveled their health properly. And the hitboxes, ooh, they be hitboxing alright. BLB is so fucking cool. Love it, love it, love it. Its moveset is wild, hard to dodge, and really unique. I love the blood spraying from its back, that stomp on the retreat always catches me, and it's always my fault. Finally, it has something no other Bloodborne boss has, a fair charge. Great boss, wish I didn't have to go through the chalices to fight it. You know what, I love this for BLB, we love it when people have supporters. I personally think it gets outshined in this game and in Sekiro, where the Guardian Ape has the exact same gimmick, but it's a genuinely solid challenge with mostly fair hitboxes and an absolutely brilliant design. If it's your favourite fight, you've got good taste. Bloodletting Beast destroyed me, and I always remember getting hit by his two-handed ground slam that always hit me even when I was behind him. I was really frustrated with him. Yeah, I've had my fair share of AoE hitboxes in Soulsborne that hit me when I feel they shouldn't, but don't let it get you down. BLB is a tough fight because make one mistake in the Parasite variant and you will likely get killed, but once you're underneath him, firepapering those legs and racking up the damage will take him down eventually. Hey, you forgot the Headless Bloodletting Beast, which was the bane of my existence for days. I know, I'm sorry I forgot to include them in the poll. I'll go commit Sudoku now. At number 5, we have the Loran Dark Beast, who scored a total average of 6.87 out of 10. Now, if this were a few years ago, the Dark Beast would likely land much higher on this list, because I remember back in the day, the Loran Dark Beast had high DPS, extremely tanky HP, and was hated by many of the prolific YouTube communities at the time. This is actually reflected in today's rankings. The Dark Beast has the 3rd highest amount of 10s from the voters, but the rest of his rankings were more spread out. The Dark Beast has the ability to inflict a lot of damage on the hunter very quickly with his fast electrified swipes. Then there's the electric AoE that you'll get stunned by if you don't move out of the way fast enough, and he's way harder to stagger than Dark Beast Parl. I was only able to around the end of the fight. He gets to use all the attacks in his arsenal, whether it's the electrified leap or the electric slam. Loran Dark Beast is ready to counter you with his own brand of aggression, and I love it. I know a lot of people hate the Loran Dark Beast, or at least the Democracy community does. Ooh, shots fired! I find the fight to be BS sometimes, but it's slowly becoming my favorite fight because no other fight instills the horror inside of me that this one does. This is a horror game, and I'm genuinely afraid when I walk into the boss room. Sometimes difficulty can be quantified in different ways, and the tension of fighting a scary boss can certainly add to that. I personally think Dark Beast is extremely cute myself, but to each their own, and if that's what makes him hard for you, who am I to judge? I last played Bloodborne about 4 years ago, and one of the few Chalice dungeon bosses I can distinctly remember my entire experience from is the Loran Dark Beast. I think I've died many more times to this boss than any other, even the Orphan of Kos. See, that's what I like about the Dark Beast enemy. It's so different to anything else in the game, as no other boss outside of the other Loran-based enemies uses electricity in such a way during their boss fight. Such a cool design, such a good beast fight that really bridges the gap between the beastly and the eldritch and makes itself memorable. The Depth 5 Loran Beast killed me 50 plus times in my Hunter Tools Only run. I'll be honest, had no idea Hunter Tools Only was a run you could achieve, but now I want to try it. At number 4, we have the Abhorrent Beast, who scored a total average of 6.89 out of 10. Gotta love that earlier we had all 3 Thumerian bosses in a row, and straight after, we've got all 3 Beast bosses in a row. I definitely agree that the Abhorrent Beast is one of the toughest fights in the Chalice dungeons, and honestly, in my humble opinion, should be in the top 3. Anytime I fight this guy, his wind and lightning based punches leave me without momentum. It's like a boxing match where you're trying to find an opening to get a punch in, but your opponent is a much higher skill level than you, so you end up being forced to focus more on defense. His enraged state only serves to buff his previous attacks, making them more deadly, but allowing you to use the knowledge of the first half of the fight to survive. It's similar to Lady Maria in that sense. Hot take, I actually think he's the best balanced fight in the Chalice dungeons, as anytime I fought him, I'd find my resources heavily drained, but I'd still always come out on top. He wasn't too easy, nor too hard. At least for me, he's just right and very learnable. And you all agree, as he scored 18 votes for favourite boss of the Chalice dungeons, the second highest on the poll. As one voter puts it, Abhorrent Beast Supremacy! That's all I got. What about the rest? Abhorrent Beast has stupidly large attack hitboxes. No matter how much I dodged, he always reached me. That's fair, I think he's harder to initially learn than some of the other fights on the list. I actually found dodging backwards or to his left to be an optimal strategy, but I'm by no means an expert on the fight, far from it. I still think his hitboxes are fine compared to, say, Bloodletting or Ball and Chain Undead Giant, though. Shockingly enough, though, there aren't any more comments for the Abhorrent Beast. Consider me gagged. I thought we'd get at least one person gushing about how it's their favourite boss, but sadly, no. Also, shout out to the one person who dared to give him a 1 for difficulty. Why didn't you share your thoughts? I would have loved to read them. At number 3, we have Aaviier, Daughter of the Cosmos, who scored a total average of 7.2 out of 10. And this is where I personally disagree with my community, as don't get me wrong, I can see why Aaviier is tough. We had this discussion in our recent Bloodborne main boss community ranking, and many comments were surprised to see our daughter this high. And it's happened again. So what is it about Aaviier that keeps her name in people's mouths? If I had to guess, I'd say it's her charge. That one bullshit charge she has that many players find incredibly difficult to dodge. It starts out of nowhere, and if you're right next to her, you don't have the reaction speed to avoid it. Then there's the frenzy build-up if you're hit by her blood spurts, which will catch some off guard, and she's got a machine gun arcane attack, which I admittedly found easier to avoid in the Chalice dungeon, but perhaps that's just me. I'm trying to figure out my voters because the few mentions of Aaviier in the comments they left are in reference to her being easy compared to other bosses. So who are these Aaviier is difficult truthers? Where are you? I will say that Aaviier in the Chalice dungeons is far more tanky than that of the main game due to being an Adept 5 Chalice, which means even when you're using thrust attacks and working with her weakness, you still have to do a lot of work to ultimately take down the Daughter of the Cosmos. Please sound off in the comments below. Why is Aaviier harder than the Abhorrent Beast and the Loran Dark Beast? I need to know. At number 2, we have the Watchdog of the Old Lords, who scored a total average of 7.89 out of 10. Is it a shock that the final 2 bosses on today's list are the 2 remaining mandatory Defiled Chalice bosses? I don't think so. After all, the Watchdog would be nowhere near the top 2 without its Defiled appearance. It first appears as the final layer boss of the first Chalice in the game, making him an absolute cakewalk. You don't even need to learn the moveset. You'll likely have enough damage to whittle him down and send him back to the kennel. But then, the Defiled Watchdog appears, and for the first time in Bloodborne history, the strategy that worked for me was dodging backwards. Sacrilege, I know, but when you've got a dog that's known for charging forwards and using combos to keep you in line, you've got to stay out of range to have a chance of doing any damage. The challenge is in figuring out which combos end where so you can get safe hits on the pup's head, as in order to do lasting damage, you need to first break the Watchdog's head open so it takes more damage, and then you can wail on it until the fight is over. However, he changes up his combos significantly as the fight progresses, and if you haven't leveled your vigor effectively, a single swipe or charge will kill you outright, forcing you to play a perfect game. But despite being a defiled boss, the Watchdog is the people's favourite Chalice dungeon fight, with 19 overall votes, and it was also mentioned more than any other fight in the voter comments. I can't highlight all of them sadly, but I will go through a select few. Okay, so I know the Yharnam Queen was the final boss, but the Watchdog was the standout boss and my favourite boss for me for the Chalice dungeons. It was one of the very few fire bosses in Bloodborne, and my god, it giving you half health for this fight was the most brutal thing FromSoft has done with Bloodborne. I died to those awful AoEs more times than I should have, and I was severely underleveled, but I worked through it after hitting my head against the wall 20 times. It truly was the Lawrence of the Chalice dungeons. What a fucking fight. Such an interesting comment, because here we have someone who thrives on the difficulty, and yet despite the negative framing of that second paragraph, the Watchdog is their favourite Chalice boss. I find this type of viewpoint fascinating because I don't fully get it, but I'm happy for you. Watchdog of the Old Lords is hands down my favourite Chalice dungeon boss. He can hit hard, and if you screw up, he can certainly punish you. However, his moveset is fair, his attacks learnable and readable, and IMO, his design is just so fucking cool. His swaggering gait, his big-ass chompers, and that AoE is a spectacle. I've spent many an hour in the Chalices, and fought the Watchdoggo in various root Chalices, including cursed ones, and he's always a joy to face. And that's the ultimate test of a boss's difficulty and likability. Are you excited to face them after the 10th time you fought them? If yes, there you go. The Defiled Watchdog was one of the hardest bosses I've ever encountered in a Souls game, even more than the Defiled Amygdala in my opinion. Probably because you fight Amygdala in the base game so you're more familiar with its moveset, and the real struggle is the tiny room with its massive damage output. Meanwhile, with the Watchdog, you only fight it once in an easier Chalice dungeon, so you're not familiar with its moveset, and the Defiled Chalice makes every one of its moves a one-shot, requiring you to try and learn its attacks, with any mess-ups killing you instantly, leaving this boss with the most amount of attempts for any boss fight in the series for me. Definitely a bold statement to be sure. I'm not really certain which boss I find more difficult, though it is possible to level up your vigor to the point where you can survive messing up an attack or two on the Watchdog, but nobody can deny this guy has likely killed more people than our number 1 placement, because the entry we're about to get to can only be accessed after beating the Watchdog. Do with that info what you will. At number 1, we have the Defiled Amygdala, who scored a total average of 8.47 out of 10. And if we compare the scores of this community ranking with the original Bloodborne ranking from a few weeks ago, Defiled Amygdala ranks higher than Lawrence the First Vicar. What a gag! Amygdala in the base game was a fair fight. You have a large arena to play around with, you aren't taking insane amounts of damage because you have full health, and you have the breathing room to learn its moveset. In the Defiled Chalice, Amygdala can kill you with a single combo that staggers you so you can't roll backwards, and this can happen almost immediately after entering the fight. You have to assume that every attack from Amy is going to get you killed, and no amount of vigor leveling is going to save you from that fate. The challenge is to hit Amy's head to do major damage, and her moveset does leave her vulnerable after each attack, but the downtime is so quick that you don't have a chance to hit her before she's off on another combo string, and that's terrifying and annoying because if you miss her, you're stuck in an animation while she's getting ready to bitch slap you. Then, in her enraged state when she rips off her arms, you have to stay under her or you'll almost certainly die. And if you don't know the trick to roll towards her tail when she jumps up into the air, that slam will also immediately kill you. It's just such a broken final part of the fight that leaves me feeling anxious and tense the entire time. The Defiled Watchdog killed me 50 times, and then I stopped counting how many times I was killed by the Defiled Amygdala after I hit triple digits. Both of those hold my personal record for number of deaths. I had to become so passive and slap the Defiled Amygdala tail to kill him safely. I can't imagine how painful that must have been. I'm so sorry you had to go through that. The range that it has compared to the damage it deals leads to crazy swings in the match. I had several attempts that went far into the fight, but was killed by making one mistake. This is the boss I lost to the most within the Chalice dungeons. With such a small boss arena, if you're not always strafing to the left while keeping Amy in the center of the room, yeah, you're gonna be in for a tough time. Defiled Amygdala is literally one of, if not the worst boss experiences in all of Soulsborne. There is nothing I hate more than a boss that is difficult because it's hard as shit to even hit once. And even if you learn how to deal damage consistently, it still can one-shot you with a move you can't even see, or prepare to dodge because of the camera angles. It's more frustrating than the Bed of Chaos. Yeah, I fully agree with this take. Even though I took the approach of staying away from Amy and keeping her in my sights the whole time, it's not how Bloodborne teaches you to fight in the main game, so it feels, in this case, the Defiled Amygdala is at odds with how the game wants you to play. Also, Bed of Chaos shout out, woot woot! Defiled Amygdala forced me to actually learn a boss that I normally breeze through in the base game. That was fine until I realized in the final third of the boss where she rips off her arms, she barely lets you hit her. This meant my successful run took over 10 minutes. Oh yeah, and if you make so much as a slight mistake throughout the entire fight, you can count yourself dead due to the half HP. This fight is all I can remember when thinking about going through the chalices, and the reason why I never want to do it again. Please put this in the video, winky face. That's perhaps the most damning thing about this boss. A successful run for a regularly skilled player can take into the double digits in terms of minutes. It is time-consuming, tedious, and doesn't respect the player's commitment to the game. I wish this wasn't a fight that was required to reach Queen Yharnam. Amy is the true super boss of Bloodborne, and I stand by that. And that's my list. Which Bloodborne Chalice dungeon boss is the hardest to you? Did my community get everything right? Let me know in the comments down below. Be sure to parry that subscribe button so you can stay up to date on all of my future videos when they come out. My social medias are on screen now, feel free to follow where you feel comfortable. I recommend my Twitter or my Discord, they're the best places to follow me, the Twitter especially. A massive shout out to my YouTube channel members, thank you so much for your support over the month, you guys are amazing. And a massive shout out to my Patreon supporters for supporting me through another month as well. I will be phasing Patreon out at the end of June, but thank you so much for your support regardless. I'll see you guys next time for another video. Adios.